All right, everybody. I hope you're having a great Sunday, which is in fact Veterans Day as well. So those of you that have served the country or served in in the U.S. military. I personally didn't serve in the U.S. military. I served in the Israeli military. But be that as it may, I think it's a very meaningful time to think about, especially the risks that people take in order to basically stand in defense of societies, but sometimes when you're in the military, you stand in defense of the state and not the people. And that's really what we're going to be talking about today. You see, there are a lot of points when I am working on stories or talking to people or giving my analysis when even though I don't believe in any of the ideals of the left, probably almost none of them, I'd have to say, I do have to give credit to some people on the left when I can. Tim Canova, Jared Beck, the attorney. They're dealing with the situation down in Broward County, Florida. There was Dennis Kucinich in the spring talking a lot about opposing the war in Syria. And even sometimes I have to defend people on the left that I don't like at all, and which I won't name now because it's not really the point. But the issue I'm talking about is that if you are a person who believes in something and the situation in front of you does not live up to your ideals, it shouldn't matter if the people involved put one flag up, the red flag of socialism or leftism or democratic socialism or communism, or on the other hand, if they put up a different flag. Let's say, I mean, I would say that if you were living in the time of the Vietnam War, there were plenty of people, and I don't know if they had the correct solution, but there were a lot of people who criticized both the South Vietnamese government, which was very corrupt and very flawed and brutal to people. It wasn't really a democratic country. And at the same time, they did not support imposing communism throughout Vietnam. So it's a difficult line to walk if you're trying to be consistent and give, basically a position that you're comfortable with. And if you're in the military, you can't do it. It just doesn't work. You have to actually leave. You have to take a huge risk doing it. But so the Intercept here, what we're getting at, I know that's a little long of an introduction. The Intercept is a publication I don't really tend to like. I've talked to Carlos Cordova about it a couple of times, and he reads some of their articles, and some of the things they do have that are pretty interesting. And they have Mehdi Hassan, who I don't agree with his politics at all. I think he does a good job. I just like in terms of presentation and in terms of, but I would say that his bias is really clear. But this isn't even his. This is Sarah Kanosian and Carlos Perez Osorio, and it says how Nicaragua uses anti-terror laws against protesters to suppress dissent. When Mariela Serrato saw her daughter and son-in-law on the evening news in late July flanked by masked police and described as terrorists, she was not surprised. She knew the authorities had been hunting the couple. Their business had been burned to the ground just days before, and a wanted poster with their faces had been circulating on social media. Paramilitaries in balaclavas had come to Serrato's house demanding that she disclose their whereabouts, but she didn't know the pair had been moving from safe house to safe house. The last time she had seen them in mid-July, they were preparing to flee their small city of Masaya, Nicaragua, with hopes of reaching Costa Rica. Now Serrato's daughter, Maria Peralta, and her husband, Christian Fajardo, are in a maximum security facility in the country's capital, Managua, facing over 30 years in prison. They are just two of more than 400 activists arrested and being prosecuted as part of Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega's crackdown on protesters who have been calling on him to resign. Nicaragua plunged into violent upheaval after protests began on April 18th, sparked by an unpopular change to the social security system. The demonstrations soon broadened, ballooning into a nationwide student-led movement against Ortega, who critics say has imposed increasingly authoritarian rule during his 12 consecutive years in power. Thousands in the streets were met with well-armed police and paramilitaries who fired into crowds, tortured and raped detainees, and arbitrarily detained leaders, the United Nations found. Over 300 people have been killed, more than 2,000 injured, and 2,000 arrested. While the streets have now been cleared of barricades and there is a veneer that the crisis is over, the country remains deeply troubled. Over 40,000 Nicaraguans are seeking refuge in Costa Rica, according to refugees, about 13,700 of which have formally sought asylum. The Nicaraguan Center for Human Rights says that over 550 Nicaraguans are still imprisoned, and the government continues to track and capture its opponents, among them students, farmers, and family members of those killed. Last month, police recently released a statement that banned protests without authorization. Many of those arrested will be tried as terrorists, thanks to a law passed by the Ortega-controlled Congress in July that expanded the definition of terrorism to include a broad range of crimes, such as damaging property. Those found guilty will get 15 to 20 years in prison. According to Roberto Larios, director of communication for the courts, over 200 people have been accused of terrorism. At least 18 people have so far been found guilty. The cases mark the first time anyone in Nicaragua has been convicted of terrorism. The state says the law was passed to comply with recommendations from the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, an international body concerned with terror financing. Former prosecutors, lawyers, activists, and protesters say that no matter the origin, the law is now being used to criminalize protest and is a thinly veiled excuse for Ortega to silence critics. It is so open that it could apply to any activity, up to passing a bag of water to someone in a barricade. Here we are facing a citizen rebellion, a social rebellion. This is not terrorism, said Alberto Novoa, a former attorney general of Nicaragua, in an interview with a local paper. So we're not going to read through this whole thing. It is a long article. It does go into a lot of like inside baseball, talking about a number of other Latin American countries. I want to go to the reaction. And like I said, the Intercept is a pretty left-leaning publication. They almost, they're pretty much very anti-war. Glenn Greenwald is the person who founded it, and I have probably, I don't like Glenn Greenwald, but there's a number of times I've seen him make appearances and say things that I have to give my respect for. The same as Dennis Kucinich. And the fact that the Intercept is willing to publish this is not the first time that a leftist paper or online outlet has done this. I believe it was The Nation published one 3 months ago that was also very critical of the Maduro government, the Ortega government. Sorry, Maduro is the president of Venezuela. And the first comment that I see here says, most of the commenters will attack you because you dare exposing abuses from a leftist government. Interesting is how obvious they disregard the facts you present while they blast your report. So this is the most recent one. I have two questions. The most popular writers of the Intercept do not expose attacks on basic freedoms from leftist governments. Is it because they fear being attacked by their hardcore supporters? The situation in Venezuela is worse. The security forces systematically abuse the opposition, according to HRW. Why nobody at TI has shown any interest in a country that has 5 hours from the U.S., that borders Brazil, and has 3 million refugees? So that's a fair point, but I would say this, okay? A lot of people have to be just realistic about it. The reason that a lot of left-wing critics, I believe, would be willing to criticize Nicaragua and not Venezuela is because Nicaragua's president, Ortega, has taken a number of positions that are not really progressive at all. He's extremely anti-abortion. He made a lot of compromises with the Catholic Church and the business community. And he also, one thing that I think should be reported, it's probably the most important issue that is never reported on from Nicaragua, and that I've talked to people about, even people that have been to the region, is that Ortega basically tried to sell his country down the river to China in order to build a second canal across the country in order to compete with the Panama Canal. And basically he bulldozed through people's property, through farmlands, through nature preserves, and his idea was that this would enrich Nicaragua and by connection him, and make it basically a much more important country than it is today. Because Nicaragua, for those of you that don't know, is the poorest country in all of Central America. It was the poorest country before the Sandinistas, and it's gotten worse because of the Sandinistas. And I'm talking about the Sandinistas are the so-called progressive movement that was founded in the mid-1960s. It was named after Augusto Sandino, who was a nationalist. Remember, he was a nationalist who was opposed to the U.S. intervention in Nicaragua in the 20s and 30s. And Sandino's name was basically, acquired and basically stolen by these left-wing rebels, led by Carlos Fonseca and eventually people like Ortega. And it became basically the far left socialist movement that overthrew the Somoza dictatorship in 1979. Somoza was a major U.S. ally in Central America and part of the Cold War alliance against communism. So then of course there was the Contra War, which devastated Nicaragua. It set the economy back very far, and then after the Contra War began to kind of simmer down in the late 80s. There was a free election in 1991. Ortega lost. The new president was Violeta Chamorro, who had been an opponent of both Somoza and the Sandinistas. And she basically she gave it the best chance. She gave Nicaragua the best chance of becoming a normal country again, because she basically enforced a constitution and began to separate the powers. It was no longer basically a direct dictatorship as it had been under both the communists, the Sandinistas, and also Somoza. But a lot of people on the left don't care about that. They would rather look at the symbolism of Nicaragua being a leftist bastion of resistance against the U.S. than to actually assess whether they follow through on their leftist ideals. And I think that, if you really want to be honest, I think that the Intercept is doing the correct thing here. They're calling out Nicaragua's leaders for not living up to the ideals of participatory democracy and the socialism that they would want, which I think is it's a mirage. It'll never happen. Ultimately, socialism does lead to dictatorship. But I would rather have leftists who are willing to at least criticize the corruption within socialism than have them, than deal with the ones that are basically claiming, well, it's better at least that cosmetically it's a socialist regime. Because, you don't want to only have these automatons to talk about. So a lot of the commenters are hating on the Intercept here. They say, "Damn, Intercept loves them some regime change propaganda these days. Amazing. Found it cute that Honduras, with a fully illegal regime installed by a U.S. coup, thanks HRC Clinton, is portrayed as the good guys here, as opposed to the fully legitimate, legally elected Nicaraguan government. Next, can we get an article from Bolton on the troika of tyranny or whatever bullshit?" So this person goes on a massive rant against the Intercept, and then some people are just taking it, they're analogizing it to some censorship that we find on the internet today. This person says, Full Count says, "Dissent, those are violent thugs in the service of foreign powers trying to depose a democratically elected government. If someone does not like the government, there are elections in Nicaragua. Why don't those dissenters try that first?" No. What these people don't understand, there's a lot of people on the left that will say, well, there were democratic elections in Venezuela. There were democratic elections in Syria. But in every case, in every one of these countries where yes, there are elections, those elections are basically rigged. And we ourselves are dealing right now with that same issue here in the USA. Okay, it's ironic that they always claim, oh, free democracy cannot, that's what they have in countries like Syria and Venezuela or whatever. And then you see that earlier this year in Canada, the left wing was basically swept completely out of power, devastated in Ontario. Things like that do happen. And I think that people have to get a grip and realize that the veneer of democracy is a joke if there's no integrity involved, if there's no transparency, and there's no transparency to democracy in any of those countries of progressive Latin America, the pink tide countries of Ecuador, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, especially Brazil until very recently, that they don't have real democracy. It's kind of a cosmetic democracy that's meant to show that it's moving forward. When in reality, it's the same type of corrupt culture that happened under non-progressive regimes. Under some people have gone to the streets claiming that the Sandinistas have become exactly like the Somozas that they replaced. And I would agree. I'm somebody, we joke a lot about this Pinochet thing and helicopter rides and whatever. I would say this. Pinochet, I don't think that he caused as much damage as most of these leftist regimes, not by a long shot. But the things that he did, he might as well have been one. He managed the economy better. Okay, but the economy does not make a free society. I would say that we live in the United States currently with an economy that's doing pretty well, but people feel less free. So okay, I would say it's important to have a good economy, but if there's not an atmosphere of liberty, if there's not an atmosphere of free speech and a lack of fear of censorship, then really economic prosperity is kind of empty, and it leads eventually to real turmoil because people eventually, whatever persuasion they are, they will rebel against suppression of freedom of speech. But yeah, these people are going nuts. They're saying, oh, look, again, the Intercept gives cover for largely right-wing protesters. Ortega may very well have overstepped with the new definition of terrorism, but that doesn't excuse what the Intercept is backing here. No, this is extremely unfair because ultimately, like I said, when the Mexican elections happened, and I'm a very right-wing individual, I said I probably would not get along with the ideas that Lopez Obrador is trying to implement in Mexico, but he won the vote, and there's no way to deny it. He won the vote by an overwhelming majority in Mexico. That's the leftist new president, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador. And a lot of people from the rest of Latin America already hate him, and they have every right to. But the fact is that when somebody wins a democratic election like that, you can't just throw it in the toilet and say, well, we don't have to recognize it because we're not going to invade Mexico. I hope not. Yeah, and people are comparing this to Syria and how they're no. I would say that if they can't accept that the Intercept can call balls and strikes on this, then there's no future for independent leftist media in the future. Independent, you see now that there's a lot of these people. This is in the other direction. There's a lot of these people who are basically saying, yes, we should stand up and make sure that every vote is counted in Broward County, even though the process itself is completely tainted. And ultimately, Bill Nelson and Andrew Gillum aren't actually going to implement any of the socialist policies they're talking about. It's a completely symbolic victory if they win anything. And then people start talking about the USA has terrorism and whatever. It's whataboutism. It's whataboutism that really is the issue here. There's some people that are just trolling here, but yeah, a lot of people are citing Max Blumenthal and Mint Press News. Mint Press News and Max Blumenthal are basically funded by Iran and Venezuela. So Why would I care what they say? They can publish what they want. I still think it's bullshit. And that's about it. So yeah, I give credit to the Intercept for writing this, even though I'm not generally a fan of theirs. And I hope in the future that the Venezuelans are able to have a government that is representative, that is transparent, and does not police literally any activity that they do. So please like this video, subscribe to my channel, subscribe to my other channel, Razor Ray Live Wounds, for the live streams that I sometimes have. And please have a great Veterans Day. Share this video and also comment. And I will also ask that you contribute to the Patreon if you can, and if you want to see more of this content. Have a great night.